Hey everyone, this week we are looking at social problems in rural communities. And social problems, happen in all types of communities, not just rural ones, but we're going to look a little bit more closely at how, as we've studied mechanical versus organic society, and also how we've studied the difference between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, or Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, how communities deal with them a little bit more, and some of the things that social scientists run up against, or sociologists run up against, when they are studying a local community, especially if they're going in to do an ethnography or something to that effect. The person that's going to help us this week with our understanding of social problems is C. Wright Mills. You've probably heard a lot about him in classes, as far as the sociological imagination is a very important concept, and we're going to look at that again today. One of my favorite quotes by him is, "Neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both." This sets the sociological imagination in its most important context, meaning you cannot go into a place that you don't know, or even that you know very well. Say, I go and study the town I grew up in. Either one of the perspectives I have, whether I'm from that area or not from that area, still needs to take into context that I have individual social problems, and those are different sometimes than the larger society's social problems. It can definitely, in a smaller community, be more likely that people have the same social problems. But let's take into account, in my family, I had a sister who was born with Turner syndrome and was constantly in and out of the hospital. I had a dad who was a truck driver who could be laid off on occasion. I was the first to graduate from undergraduate school, college, and then pursue a PhD. So my family's education was not as highly at a level that others in the surrounding area might have had. That was my individual experience of life growing up. And there's all kinds of problems that were probably involved. And you too have those individual problems. But then there's also a history that I've inherited. For example, when we think about our race, being white, being female, our gender, our history of what we've experienced in certain communities. I was a person who was from working class family, but I was also in a community growing up that was a little more socioeconomically stable. And so I had a really excellent high school that I attended. And there's all types of things that intersect when we're talking about the social problems, and the individual's problems and the problems of the community may or may not be exactly alike. But if they're enough alike, if there is a problem that continues to develop, for example, in a mostly white community, when we start seeing different racial groups or ethnic groups start to migrate into communities, we often see problems of people being xenophobic or racist, and that's a social problem if it gets to a certain level. It's obviously a social problem at an individual level, no matter what. But we start to see the social aspect of it at the larger scale when we see that history intersect with the individual problems and constantly cause that to be something at a larger scale. We'll talk more about that as we go. C. Wright Mills was a sociologist who was out of Columbia University in the 50s, and he was a sociologist that believed our knowledge was crucial in understanding social change that would promote the social changes that we want to see, as far as our drive in sociology to look at social problems and say, we can do things about racism, we can do things about xenophobia, we can do things about how people look at gender, and how we can understand a society where the problems that are up and against people's lives can be engaged. And everybody has wisdom and knowledge as to get to that. He was considered radical at his time, and definitely a social theorist that is lifted up in talking about and not avoiding social problems. So Black Lives Matter, for example, would be something he would be excited about as far as people engaging the conversation. Understanding that we have political diversity that is causing such polarization right now that people need to talk and speak up about that. This would be his joy to see people actually engaging it and not avoiding it. He also has been given the status of a very prestigious award that exemplifies outstanding sociological work done in social change. And so it's something that we keep in mind with him when we look at social problems, is that we're not just looking at the problems just for the problems themselves. We're trying to enact social change of some sort. He felt society did need to change. And think about the 50s. You know, this is before the civil rights movement. We're coming off of World War II, and he is coming into the foray of the sociological field. He's seeing people that are being treated with inequality, not only in the United States, but across the globe. He's seeing the development of capitalism, and he's seeing it in a way that doesn't necessarily heighten everybody's possibility. And especially when we consider rural life, he sees the commodification of the farming family, and he sees also the changes in the social landscape and how we value individuals. So he would have said during this change that, or during this time, that social change was needed, inevitable, and an important aspect of what it means to be a sociologist, not only then, but today. He felt that critical thinking, meaning we're thinking about these things, we're trying to develop solutions, but we also understand we have biases. And so solution building needs to be done with and connected with people that are experiencing the social problem, and they need to be lifted in a way that they can help make that solution happen. Meaning that power plays a major role in sometimes creating the social problems, because those with power are not always understanding or have the empathy even of the situation, and are often trying to allow themselves to remain in the lead position that they maintain, rather than actually helping with the solution or a problem. So for example, corporate farms right now and rural sociology study are something that we look at a lot, because although there is employment there, there is definitely some loss of identity and how we see our food production, and also how we see families developing in these communities because of corporate farms. So those with the power and the ability to continue to farm in our current economy may be thinking there's a major solution that's happening because of the maintained farm, but we have to keep in mind all the social problems that come along with that. And he also said it's important for us to think with the sociological imagination. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Finally, he said it's the political task of the social scientist to translate personal troubles, which we're going to talk about also again in a second, into public issues, understanding that certain personal problems, you may have a personal problem and it may really just be a personal problem. But if you start to see people down your block, for example, start to develop cancer, and you notice a local plant nearby that's dumping chemicals into the water, that's suddenly a social problem, because it's not just something, that maybe you had cancer and it was developed because you had genetic inheritance of a certain type of cancer. That's certainly a problem, but that's not necessarily a social problem. It's when we see that social life affected by something at such a great rate that we have to think of it as a public issue. And then how does the public get involved so that that problem can be solved? And what does it mean exactly? How are personal problems a matter of public issue? And I want you to think of a few maybe that you have experienced in your lifetime. Were there social problems with racial injustice, or were there social problems with unemployment, or the availability of resources when you were growing up? I invite people to use a toolbox then to interpret social problems, including in this toolbox a sense of the sociological imagination, the sociological perspective, and the social location of what's going on with the problem that you're studying. This toolbox can be applied to whatever setting you're going into. And it also invites you to consider your ethnocentrism in the process and to recognize that you will bring your own ideas and values to this that you need to check before you actually do the work. Because as we look, for example, with J.D. Vance, as he studies his family and his community, he's very aware of the difference in his life based on some of the opportunities, and where he actually said, you know, his poverty actually served him because he was able to go to an elite school and maintain this law degree and get all of these degrees. And that's something, though, that then when he looks back on his life, even though it's his own memoir, those personal problems that he is lifting up and social problems still have a bias to them. And he has to still kind of imagine life a little bit differently, even though it was his own. So we'll talk about that. But anyway, this toolbox can be used in urban, rural studies. It can be used in all kinds of ways when we're looking at problems and how it affects people. So the three things in this toolbox: sociological imagination, sociological perspective, and social location. First, sociological imagination, looking at people's actions and attitudes in the context of the social forces that shape them. Not you, them. Understanding the narrative is really important, and it's very difficult to do if you have no context of what's going on. I am a person, for example, who is a white female who was raised in a family that by the time I came around, because I was the youngest, faced different economic hardships, and not the same types of hardships that my brother and sister might have when my parents were younger and still trying to make it, and Jill going through different kinds of issues. So even with your own family, if there's 14, 15 years between you and the oldest in the family, or the youngest in the family, because your problems may have been different, that very little scope of your own household can have a different context, a different time period, a different way in which you came to life and were able to engage the world based on what was going on in your birth year, through your developmental years, and through your formative years of trying to enter into adulthood. So know that sociological imagination isn't just some big thing out there. It's sometimes just looking at your own family context and the differences in your own household, and then start to apply that to community, and then try to apply that then to other people's lives that you may not know, but you might be studying and thinking, I may not know what that's like because I had a different context and I had a different way of looking at things. And the forces that shaped me are different than the forces that shaped them. And that's the first thing you have to do. Social perspective then helps us to see the larger forces that are influencing our lives. Studying a rural community that is used to, for example, immigrants participating in farm life or participating in industrial life, because it's happened as a long historical part of their life. We see places like Emporia where that is a social livelihood of who we are, whereas a small rural community that may never have experienced immigrant life or migrants even from other parts of regions coming in may be a very different social perspective when it comes to that community finding its glue. And so there's a lot of times where we can not take into mind that social perspective, what's going on in the larger social forces, and even the sense of having a history of the types of forces and how we have normalized them and what is normal. So keeping in mind different ways in which social life is happening. And then finally, social location refers to where you're located in society. It's not only considering, like, for example, that you're in a rural setting, but it's also thinking about your socioeconomic level. There may be people in a small town where there's a large group of people who are suffering more than others because they're under the poverty line, whereas there may be another smaller group of people that have more resources, higher socioeconomic level. Some of them might be the owners of the farms or the community stores. Those things are important for us to remind ourselves that your location in society is not just about, where you live, but it can affect, for example, if you're living on a certain side of town that people consider the wrong side of the tracks. Those ideas of what people place upon you as far as your social location and how you're labeled sometimes play a part in how the social problems you're dealing with come to life. And those social problems are definitely felt by whole communities when they are labeled in such ways, including the elites and including those who are considered in the middle classes. So there's a couple points I want to make then when we're looking at social problems. First of all, in rural life, the experience tends to engage like social problems based on lack of resources. And as you noticed in the video about, how far a doctor is away and considering that, I've always been near doctors and I can't imagine that. But there are times where I have met people that have said they've had to come into Wichita or come into places for specialty doctor's appointments, and it may take 2 or 3 hours out of their day, and they may have to do that 2 or 3 times a month. And that just changes the way life and the problems that you're dealing with looks comparatively than if they're right down the block or even just a few miles away. The other piece that we have to keep in mind is that rural communities often lose resources that they may have had before, like the local grocery stores, the being able to maintain proper food resources. These are places that actually produce our food, but there are food deserts, and we talk a lot about that in this department, where there are high agricultural farms in parts of Kansas and ranches, and yet people are starving for good food because the local grocer cannot stay in business. Medical deserts, doctors being able to be maintained. There are major programs right now trying to attract doctors, and a lot of times we see immigrants coming into communities because it's a great opportunity to find your footing and live in a new life because of some of the advantages for that. But then there's also social problems based on the mechanical society accepting people, or that sense of Gemeinschaft where they're more inward turned, so that trust is sometimes hard to develop. Brain drain is something we see because the young people or people with opportunities to kind of further their life cannot find them sometimes in their rural settings. Often we see females, as we see more equality and opportunities for women as they continue to develop. We see a lot of times the largest migration then out of a community, the out migration, is female driven. Therefore, those males who are left behind, for reproduction of any kind, there's a lot of times some difficulty there. We also see a lot of times of people with different political perspectives or experiences. Let's think of people with different gendering identities or sexual orientation, and they may find themselves experiencing more acceptance in larger urban settings. And even though they may be loved and accepted in the communities that they are part of, in those small rural towns, even by families and friends, there's a lot of times the opportunity for being able to find like connections or a sense of just political differences a lot of times are something that we see change in those settings. And that's something that, by the way, again, is not just in an American setting. It is something that we see happen across the globe. Finally, education. A lot of times people migrate out of, and then therefore social problems happen because people are seeking higher education and they don't return, and that because they have no place in which to get a job when they are finished with receiving that education. So a lot of those problems are similar problems to what happens in rural life currently, and we have to remember that many of these are new because we didn't require higher educations 150 years ago. We didn't have that sense of urban life. In fact, it was healthier to live in smaller communities, and we had local doctors that would go do house visits. And so a lot of this is quite new for many communities. Point two, understanding the social problems of rural social communities requires the use of the sociological toolbox in order to fairly assess what is going on. And what I'm doing is breaking this down again, meaning that sociological imagination is very important, but also, again, that social context and that social location is key for us to understand more about that. And so I want to break that down a little bit. As we use the toolbox, we have to recognize what we're trying to do is first look at the characteristics of social problems and identify for ourselves our biases and know the difference between objective conditions and subjective concern. And the first thing is that objective conditions are the conditions of society that can be measured or experienced, meaning we can measure objectively people's salaries or levels of education or medical situations. Those are objective conditions, but concerns come when we see the subjective concern, the concern that a significant amount of people or a number of significant amount of people have experienced these subjective conditions at a negative rate, at a negative experience of them. And it can go two ways. It can also be positive. We can see objective conditions causing people to have more resources. So it can be negative or positive. But we have to recognize that people are involved in whatever that may be, and people's views on how those objective conditions are coming or measuring out toward their prosperity or their health versus their demise or their lack of resource is something that we're trying to measure and understand from the perspective of everybody's objective conditions and how it affects them. Social problems are dynamic. Simply put, society and people change. So a town may have looked very prosperous years ago. People may not have felt the same social problems, and they may have a remembered past that is so close to them, even, a generation away, where that social problem like meth, think about how many times we see our rural communities dealing with meth. And as we've seen our local communities not be able to afford, for example, keeping a police department or any kind of maintenance on housing, and there's just a sense of lack of community glue, that those are hot spots for places for like drugs and alcohol abuse to be more prevalent. And we've seen this, for example, in Southeast Kansas. When you head towards Southeast Kansas and Southeast Missouri, if you go onto a website that basically says, "Is my neighborhood a meth lab?" Look that up, and it will scroll down our counties, and you'll see the busted, the meth labs that have basically been discovered, and the numbers continually increase as you go toward Southeast Missouri or Southwest Missouri and Southeast Kansas. And so those issues are new for a lot of these communities. And I think about this question: how's the society that you're studying changed just in the last 20 years? What's the dynamic that's been going on there? Three, when we're looking at this piece, again, using the toolbox, we have to recognize social problems are relative. What some people value, others might not. A belief about what is good or bad is a value, and some of us have different values. It's an idea that people get behind. And so some people may value the conditions of a more traditional patriarchal society, whereas other people may value a more gender equality experience of life and develop their households around that. And those values are different. And so we have to recognize when we're using our toolbox to identify the values and see it through the eyes and the lens of the people, even though we may not agree with it. Social problems involve then competing views. It involves power and control. And this is what C. Wright Mills would often say is something to be very aware of. Who's in power? Who's in control? Who has the ability to make choices about their lives? And who are the conflicting groups? And so when you see the problems that you're looking at in your community, you may look at more deeply some of the ideas about who has the power and who does not have the power and why, and how is that affecting the community. The third point I'd like to make in this is that people in rural settings then may not trust outsider solutions to their social problems. This mechanical Gemeinschaft community often has gotten through the problems themselves, either addressing them with what they've had at their disposal and or adapting. And outside forces, including government, is often seen as something of a threat. And so this is important to keep in mind in rural settings. It's not in all rural settings, but you may see a heightened level of people not trusting outsider solutions. And then finally, the point that I would like to end on is our own ethnocentrism. We have to identify and note that when we look at a social problem and discover that in a rural community, that we have to evaluate what we have said. What are the things that we've biased? When people use derogatory terms for rural communities, and you can think of all those terms, you can make a list. I would invite you to think of the list of derogatory terms that are used for small rural communities. Write them down. Do you have problems with them? And then allow yourself to evaluate the situation, knowing that you have those biases. That is your own sense of ethnocentrism. You have an ethnicity of your own, maybe an ethnicity of being white and American if you are looking at a community outside of the US, maybe a sense of being an urbanite, maybe even being a rural town person who has some deep-seated feelings about the community that you grew up in that are maybe negative. Trying to allow cultural relativism to come to the fore when you're doing your research is most important, because what you're trying to do is depict their life, what is going on, and try to give a sense of identity and a sense of what is going on in these communities through kind of an ethnographic picture. Who are they? How do they identify themselves? What is the glue that keeps them together? And how can we then appreciate the culture even in our critique? So what social problems affect the community you are studying? That's the question for this week. I'm looking forward to reading your answers. Again, if you need to get a hold of me, my phone number is 913-553-0267 and my email jtodd@emporia.edu. Have a good week.